All right, welcome back to Web 110 HTML and CSS. So I took a bit of a break between recording the last video talking about Flexbox and then recording this video. So sorry if there's anything that doesn't quite line up with how I was saying I was going to do the next one, since I did take a bit of a break and I can't quite remember what sort of headspace I was in when I was recording the last one. But this video is going to be talking about working with the grid layout. We're going to continue working with the bird example, and then what I think I'm going to do is with the media queries video, which is going to be the next video, I think I'm going to then show you how you could create a template website that you could use then to help you out with the final video. So out of the two methods, and I do have the notes up here that I started out with last time, so we can kind of compare Flexbox and grid layout. And what I'm probably going to do is I'm going to just move this down so that way it's underneath all of these. But in comparison to Flexbox, in Flexbox you are controlling a smaller area and you are only able to control it in one dimension. And you already know from looking at the bird activity that even when you're working in one dimension, you still can end up working with rows. So if you've got, let's say the bird example is a really good one because we basically are only working with one row, but if you have wrap indicated, then technically it's breaking down into more and more rows, even though you're controlling everything as one long string of information. So grid is going to be different because we can actually work with it in two dimensions, and it's great for working with large layouts. You can also work with small layouts as well if you really want to, and it's going to be a lot more structured in how you are organizing the information, which makes sense because it's using that word grid. And just to go over a little bit of the history of working with websites, back when websites were fixed layouts, a lot of times people would use tables, which we haven't talked about yet. That's going to be our next chapter, is going to be tables, so you'll kind of have a little bit of an idea. But chances are you've probably all worked with tables at some point or other. And so with tables, you can kind of put any sort of information in those tables, and so people would determine how many rows and how many columns something would need to take up inside of a table, and then they'd be able to control, okay, well, how big is this cell in the table going to be so it can fit all this content, and they would organize everything that way. So grids actually work really similar to tables, where you can basically do a similar thing. You can kind of figure out how many cells you would need something to take up, so how much space is it going to have to take up, how many rows there are going to have to be, how many columns there are going to have to be. And so anything that you kind of want to organize more in the way that you would sort of a table, you're going to want to use a grid layout. Versus that flexible box layout, it's really giving a lot of parameters to how something is going to kind of resize and work as this flexible container where it could wrap onto another row, it might not. Versus the grid layout, it's going to be very particular in how you put things in a specific location. And then what you do to make it responsive is you say, in the desktop version, I want the grid to look like this. In the tablet version, I want the grid to look like this. In the mobile version, I want the grid to look like this. And so you would change that grid design depending on your sets of styles. And that's why this chapter is so large and why it introduces Flexbox, grid, and media queries all at once, is because they work so well together with each other. But it does make this chapter very long, and it also makes it very complicated because it's a lot of very big concepts all at the same time. So I'm going to actually go to our page, and this is going to be perhaps a little bit different for you, but I've got a couple of resources here. So the last page that we looked at in the last video would have been the right way to structure HTML pages, and next I've got the 960 grid system, and I think we'll go ahead and take a look at these. So I can't remember if we looked at this before. If we did, I think it would have been in the video where I was talking about styles for chapter 3. And because that video was getting very long, if we looked at it, I'm sure that we didn't look at it for very long. So what this website does is it shows you how you can break down a website based off of these grid lines. And a lot of times what designers will do is they will pick a certain amount of grid columns that they want. And you don't necessarily have to worry so much about rows just because we scroll websites vertically. Basically, like if you think back to that other link, you break up a website into sections of horizontal content, and then you organize things based off of columns to figure out how things are going to line up. And a lot of times when people design things, they want to design things in a set number of columns where you can kind of break that down into many different ways of dividing it. So 12, for example, like you'll see this says 12 columns, this says 16 columns, so 12 columns. What that gives you is you can actually use all 12 columns, or what you can also do is you can create groupings. So you could have things in 6 columns, you could have things in 4 columns, you could have things in 3 columns and 2 columns. So something like 12 is a really great number because it can break down into a lot of different possibilities. And what you'll notice on this website is that content is lining up with these, and it just really makes the website more orderly, and it makes it so everything is more clear and it feels like it has more structure to it. And it's not necessarily going to be everything, but you'll notice that like here we've got the text here for Drupal that's lining up with the text down here. Everything is lining up at this point. So that would be kind of a starting point. And then you'll notice that more than 12 columns, because not all 12 columns are necessarily going to be used, but we can kind of see that there's basically a grouping of, there's kind of like this column here. So I would say this is more like a 3 column, but it still has the flexibility of being able to use those anywhere else, because we've got this content here is kind of lining up with the second column. Now, it would maybe be a little bit better if they stretch this navigation a little bit further so it also lined up here. And sorry, this is so small. Let me see if I can zoom in a little bit so you can see that a little better. So if we were to have everything line up, maybe this could move over a little bit. And then same thing here. This is kind of stretching out to where this column is, but you'll notice we also have a lot of content following this line. And so that's just kind of helping with the structure of everything. And so if you're more interested in the design side of creating websites, this is something that you would want to consider. And if you take more digital media classes, you'll end up taking classes where you learn about Photoshop and Illustrator and then also UX design software like Adobe XD or Xure, where they actually have the ability to kind of build up these grids and you can kind of plot everything out. This one's a nice example. You can really see that structure of these 3 columns going across. And then I would say like these icons don't necessarily line up with that structure, but they are trying to keep everything in line. And I would say that is something that I see as an early design issue that students often have when they're first starting off designing websites, is that they tend to get really focused on local relationships of a design. So kind of thinking about how this part might look. And then they don't necessarily consider the whole composition, which would be everything that you're seeing on the screen at once and how everything goes together. And that just happens when you're new to designing, because you are so focused on learning every individual piece. And so sometimes you just have to step back and tell yourself, I need to look at this whole design and how everything's going together. Now, you don't have to worry about that so much in this class because this class is so technical focused. It's really focusing on just the HTML and CSS and you learning how to work with the code. But eventually, as you take more and more classes, that is going to be something that you are going to want to think about, is how everything kind of comes together. This one's kind of a nice example of how you can break things down where there's kind of this strong 2-column design, but then also, since it's got that 12 columns, it can also break down into 3. And it doesn't have to be this symmetrical. There's some other good examples that aren't quite as symmetrical. Like this one doesn't feel quite as symmetrical, but it does kind of have a strong 2-column design where everything's lining up on these sides. This one's kind of, I like looking at this one a lot in class because this one we've got like the 2 columns here with these 2 images. We've got this part that's breaking down into 4. We've got these covers that are breaking down into 6. And just the way that they're laying everything out and spacing it, it just makes it feel like it has a really clean structure and it's easy to see. And then what they're doing to kind of help break things up is they're changing the background color of everything, so that way it makes it really clear. Here's a section, here's a new section, so that way people don't get too confused. Now this one I might have to zoom in. Let's see. Now it's still kind of blurry, and maybe if I were to open this in the, like, go to open in, let's try this. I don't think it's going to be any better. So this one is really faint, and so you might not be able to see this, but what they do is they have the text here, and then they have a line that goes across to kind of help designate this is all one section. And then here they have the text, and they've got a line that's real faint, and so it's kind of letting you know, okay, well, this is going to be its own area. And then we've got featured articles, has a line, and then it has another horizontal break. So it's using these horizontal rules to help kind of divide up these spaces. And it might not actually be a horizontal rule. It could be a border line or something, but it's basically the idea of a horizontal rule to kind of help break these up. And so they're different sections, but they all have kind of this structure, so it feels very cohesive. Now, I would say with general proximity rules, I do think that it would maybe help for there to be a little bit more spacing between these items. Maybe the featured works and the labels for everything could have the same spacing, but then the content individually, maybe if they added like a little bit more padding to just kind of remove this from this content, it would help let you know, okay, these are going to be subcategories. But it does really look nice and orderly how all of this is lining up in columns going down. Here's one that I really like looking at too, because this is another example of it doesn't necessarily have to be symmetrical, because I do think that a lot of the good examples are symmetrical, but I don't want people to feel like they have to design everything being symmetrical forever. So like this one, I would say looks a little bit more like 60% of the page is on the left column and then 40% is on the right. But again, because everything is lining up with each other, and like this picture, kind of the halfway point is where these 2 columns are splitting into 2. It feels really orderly, and that really helps. And even as it is breaking up content into these horizontal sections, it's trying to make sure that they break at the same point, so that way you don't have kind of an awkward stair step kind of look to the design. And some of these aren't even necessarily great examples either. Like this is one where I think the visual hierarchy is really lost in the design. They've got a very, I don't know if you'd say like cohesive palette, like color palette style guide, where they're definitely going for the green. They have a very clear idea of how they're using everything, but with how they're organizing everything and spacing it, it's getting kind of lost. And so I think that they could actually use more contrast and more white space. And that's where like I have students tell me all the time, I talk so much about white space, but I think this is a clear example of why you would need white space to help you figure out how you want to divide things. Because we've got some headings here. Sorry, I can't really read this. It's too blurry for me. But we've got these clear headings, and so we know that these are separate categories, and I would say just adding a little bit more space between each of these, maybe putting some sort of, maybe even a faint border or something like this that has all of these links, It just seems very lost in all this surrounding information. And so I'd almost want to put it in containers, kind of like this one, where there's got even just like faint boundaries around it to kind of help divide up the content. And just a little bit more spacing might help break that up a little bit. So you can use this and kind of look at it for inspiration. It's just a really good website to look at. And then we'll get back to this. This is going to be the link for the W3 Schools' actual information on working with a grid. And hopefully this will end up helping you in the future. As you can kind of see here, it's going to be a similar issue to some of the other examples we've looked at where they just go div crazy. And it can be a little hard to kind of read through what we're looking at. So just be kind of careful there. Now, this, I don't remember if I mentioned this. I might have linked to this when we were looking at Chapter 3's content. But this is a good book called Making and Breaking the Grid. If you are not as interested in design, I wouldn't worry about really looking at it. But if you are interested in design, you might check it out from the library and just kind of take a look at it. It's all about printed design. So if you are really interested in digital media and website design, it's not even necessarily worth buying per se, but I think it's just good for looking at, just because it really helps to show you how graphic designers are trained to, if I can actually get an example, it'll show you how graphic designers are actually trained to create 2-page spreads. And what I think is really beneficial about this, even though it's a different kind of design, is just this idea. And it looks like they don't really show you any good examples, but it's important because it helps you start thinking about everything as a large composition and how everything looks all together rather than just as these individual pieces. So I think this would be beneficial to take a look at. I'm going to just double check again that there's some examples. They're just so tiny in here that you don't really get the full extent of what it's looking at. They have a lot that are like this, but even broken down more like this looks a little overwhelming because they're just completely gridding everything out. What's kind of nice in this picture though is they are helping to demonstrate the columns, and then the term for this area it's really tiny. The term for this area that's in between, that's called a gutter. And whenever you are designing, like here, there you have these 2 columns and they have this spacing between it. That would be potentially your padding or your margin, depending on how you're creating that. Probably your margin. If you were designing with a grid, that would be your gutter. And you might be familiar with that term if you've done like graphic design before, or even like comics will use that term too for the space in between different panels. It's called a gutter. All right, so let's get into working with our grid. So I'm going to take this part of the notes. I'm just going to move it towards the bottom. I just wanted to have us be able to get a chance to look at them both in comparison. All right, so when you're working with a grid, you can also work with a fixed size or a flexible size, and you can contain one or more grid items. So this is going to be really similar. So you're going to have a container, and I can add that container with items. So just like working with the Flexbox, you have the larger space that you are creating and then the things that go inside of it. Now, if you were using this for your whole website, chances are your grid container would be your wrapper, and then all of the different items inside of it would be like your header, your nav. If you have a hero image that is outside of your content, like we have in our assignment, your main, your footer, all of those would be your items that would be inside of it. In a similar way to the Flexbox, this also has recently reached W3C Sorry, I have a hard time typing and thinking at the same time. So W3C is now recommending grid layouts, and they are also becoming better supported in newer browsers, though older browsers might still have difficulty being able to show a grid layout. And your book is going to do a really good job of talking about that a little bit further. Let me see if I can find that section. All right, so this is kind of jumping ahead a little bit because we're going to look at some other information kind of close to this section of Chapter 8, Progressive Enhancement with the Grid, but there is a CSS feature query, and we're going to come back to that when I talk about media queries. But what this does is you can write in your code @supports and then in parentheses display grid. And so what that's going to do is it's going to, and you can see here, it's a conditional that can be it's a conditional that can be used to test for support of a CSS property, and if support is found, it applies whatever rules are going to be in this curly brackets. So you could basically say, I want the display to be this, and then, so that could be your fallback, and then underneath of it, you could write @supports display grid, and then you could write out all of your styles for display grid, and it could be also your Flexbox too. So that way, if you're worried that older browsers aren't going to show your Flexbox, you could have other settings in place for how it's going to be shown. And then you could write this @supports, and then you could write all of your styles for your grid, for your Flexbox, and you could just say, here's what I want. And all it's doing is it's adding one more area that you put your styles in. So you would write your styles just the same. It would just be inside of these curly brackets for the @support section. And that will probably make a little bit more sense in the next video when I introduce working with media queries. But just wanted you to know that there is a way for you to handle that. For your homework, and for like the final and everything, you don't have to worry about adding in this @supports rule. I just wanted you to know that this exists to help when you are wanting to include kind of more recently supported code in your websites, and you're worried that older browsers might not be able to show it, and you want to make sure that your websites are accessible to everyone. So you could use this as a way to give flexibility in having styles for older browsers and then styles for newer browsers. All right, so I'm going to put in a little note here that you also need to configure the grid container, because that will be a bit of a reminder. And what I'm going to do with this example over here, because we're going to do the same thing with the birds, I'm going to make sure I save that. And then let's go to File, Save As. And in the same folder, I'm going to change this so it says grid. And so we're going to copy it into a new file. And then this will allow us to go and just save it. So rather than this being Flexbox, we can do grid layout. And then I'm going to delete all of the styles for gallery and the styles for image. And then this will save us the effort of not having to type out all of this bird stuff all over again. Just a bit of a warning. Whenever I do this example, writing grid and writing bird over and over again, I create a lot of typos. So if you catch me doing a typo, and I might not even catch it myself, just know that it's very easy to happen when you see these words that are really similar to each other. So you might end up having the same issue. But I'll try to catch all of my typos as they go along. But I do know that I have a tendency to start writing GERD instead of grid as I do this. All right, so the first thing, and kind of back to that last statement, is we must configure the grid container. So just like with the Flexbox, whatever is going to be our container, in this case it's our div with the ID of gallery, and that's how we are going to be selecting our style, is through the ID. So I'm going to say I want the display to be grid, and then just like working with the Flexbox, there's going to be properties that we are going to apply to the container. And then there's going to be properties that we can apply to the items as well. And I'm going to actually lean on the book quite a bit to help illustrate a lot of these things. So when you're working with a grid, it ends up being very different, because with the last one we were focused a lot on the items, and the grid, it focuses a lot on the boundaries. It's very focused on sort of this table idea of everything. And what's really great about this part of the textbook is it highlights these words. So you have these grid lines, and that's how you are going to designate how much space something takes up. Is you're going to say, this is going to span from grid line of 1 to grid line of 4, or for rows and columns as well. And just a refresher, because it might have been a while for you. Columns go vertically up and down. Rows go horizontally left to right. So like this row 1, that's going left to right. And then we've got our columns going up and down. So you've got your grid lines, your grid rows are what's going across, your grid columns going up and down. The grid gap would be if you want to have any sort of gutter space, basically your padding. If you want any sort of padding in between your items, you would need to put that in as a grid gap value. And so that's why it's nice to have this illustration to help kind of show what that looks like. So we're going to take this exact same bird example. So we've got all of that. And then the first set of properties that we're going to be looking at is grid template column. So it's saying, as a template, I want to kind of organize all of these things so that way there's going to be a certain amount of rows and a certain amount of columns. Now this right now is a fixed way of working with a grid, which is fine. And the way that you say how many columns it's going to be is how many values you give it. So if you only gave it one value, it would know that there's only one column. If you put in 2 values, and it would know there's 2. And you just put spaces, and that's how it knows how many columns there's going to be. It's the same thing with the rows, where you tell it how large the rows are going to be, and you put in how many values, and that's how it's going to know how many rows there's going to be. So you could add a little note over here if you want. There's going to be grid template columns. And a lot of times people get confused. Like if you have an error, more often than not, a lot of it is if you just forget that S on the end. So there's grid template columns, S, and then grid template rows properties. And I'm just going to kind of group those together. So you want to say how many columns and rows by number of values. And you can also say, like, let's say for rows, you could just say like auto, and it's going to kind of figure it out based off of the size of the content and just kind of how much space it would need to fit. So that could be something you could also do. Let me do for fixed values, you can use pixels. So hopefully that kind of helps get across all of that. So here, what we're going to do, and I'm just going to kind of copy off what the book had. So we're going to do grid template columns, and what they're doing for starters is, so these images are 200 pixels by 150, and they basically want to add a little bit of white space. And so rather than using the grid gap property yet, because it hasn't been introduced in the reading yet, what they are doing is they're saying, if we just add 20 pixels to each size, it's going to create this illusion of there being space. So that's why they're doing that. So 220 pixel, 220 pixel, 220 pixel, and then grid template rows, 170 pixel, 170 pixel. So I can save that, and then we haven't opened this yet, so I just need to go find my file. All right, so now what's happening is each one of these items inside of the grid, it's spanning, like this first bird picture is going all the way over here and it's going all the way down. So this white space is also part of this area. So when you have an item, you don't necessarily need the thing inside of it to be the exact same size. You can kind of make it larger, you can make it smaller, you can kind of handle it however you want. So this is kind of nice where it's giving us this space. Now you'll notice right now this whole grid is fixed because of all these dimensions, so this isn't resizing as well. So in this particular case, I think working with the Flexbox would give you a lot more options. You could go in here and you could change the values to being like percentages. It really just kind of depends on what you want to do with it. Now for the example, the next thing that they want us to look at is going to be working with the gaps. Oh, and you know what? Before we go into that, I just want to point out, let me see if I can find this in the book. All right, so when you are working with these different grid template columns and rows, you've got a couple of different ways that you can write things. So they have the example of working with units that are fixed, like pixels or ems. And then you can also do percentages. And then there's this unit that is abbreviated with FR, and that's a flex factor unit that directs the browser to allocate a fractional part of the remaining space. So it's just kind of saying, like, let's say that you have your whole website and you have a left navigation, and you for sure know that you want the left navigation to be 100 pixels or something. And you'll see a later example of this. And then what you could do is you could say, I want the other content, so like the main, I want that to just take up whatever the remaining space is. You would use the FR unit to just say, I want that to be just a fractional of 1. And it would just know that it's going to take up the rest of that space. Here it has auto, and then you can use min-max. And then you can also use repeat, and that's another one that we're going to look at in our example. Here it shows the grid layout where it shows working with the gaps, and you can do gaps in a couple ways. You can specify the column gap, the row gap, or all of the gaps. So we can just add a little note here. Just do gap property. Well, oh, and now I'm confusing my C's as well. Okay, so gap property, or maybe I should say gap, column gap, row gap properties instead. And these you can use a percentage. You could also do a fixed amount. I would say, I would think that chances are with things that are closer together, I would probably treat it like padding, where probably using a fixed amount would probably make the most sense. Now, there's a newer property as well that, depending on the browser, it might be better to use. And I don't know, actually. Here we go. So there is a property that's older that's called grid gap, and then gap is the newer one. So I'm just going to put here, so we have gap, and then the old version was grid gap, and then we have column gap. Old version would have been grid column gap. So it's just, it's making it shorter. So what you'll notice in a lot of these versions is that they list it twice. So they're basically saying, I want to have a grid gap of 2 ems, and then I want a gap of 2 ems, and it's just saying, you know, if this is an older browser and it's not going to show the gap property correctly, then we'll just apply grid gap as well. So it'll essentially override it, and it's just helping with those older browser versions. And I don't know I'd have to double check in here if it says. I don't know where it might say all of that. It looks like it kind of skims over that information a little bit. All right, but the next thing I wanted to look at is the fact that you can take something like this where you've got the 220 over and over again, and you can use the repeat to abbreviate it so that way you don't have to write out so much. So I'm just going to write this a little bit lower so that way we still have a record of both of them. And what you do is you write repeat and then in parentheses. So this will be really similar to like RGB, where you have to have everything kind of butted up against each other. And then the values that you have are going to be you're going to have commas between them. So you're going to say, I want to have 3 values. So whatever the values are, the number of them, you'll put in however many so it knows how many to expect. And then you'll say, so it's going to repeat for 3 times. And then you want it to repeat the value of 200 pixels. And in this next one, we're basically going to be adding in the gap as well. So then we're going to do grid template rows auto. So what's going to happen here is it's automatically going to figure out how many rows it needs to have based off of how many items are inside of the container. And then it's going to look at the content and it's going to know that those images are 150 pixels. And so it's just going to make sure that those rows are large enough to fit the 150 pixels that are already designated in the image attribute anyways. So it's going to know to do that. And then we're going to put in our grid gap and just say, and I'm going to use what the book had, grid gap of 2M, and then we'll do gap of 2M, save that, and then I can refresh, and you'll notice it looks a little bit different. You know, it's slightly, 2Ms isn't necessarily the exact equivalent of 20 pixels, but what's nice now is that this is actually being controlled now with the gap. And so each picture is exactly in that item. So we can kind of, we can separate the individual pieces from the spacing around it. Because now if I wanted to, I could go in and I could say, well, actually, maybe I want this to be 1M instead. And I wouldn't have to individually think about every single picture. So that makes it really nice to be able to work with. So this works really great if you have kind of this real kind of repetitive sort of design where you're just plotting every single thing out by kind of the columns and the rows. And you're always going to need to do this, but you also need to at times specify where things are going to be located, because this is very straightforward. It's basically saying we've got these items and they're just going to kind of go in this order and they're going to be this exact size and it's going to repeat however many times. But if you have content that's going to be different, like if with a website where the pages get very complex, you're going to have to go back to this idea of working with the spacing of everything and where everything fits in between those lines. So this section is really helpful. 2-column grid page layout. This is page 280. And so what this is showing is you have this header, and some of these have fixed dimensions and some of them don't. And so you would have to sort of piece things together a little bit. But what's really great about this is it's telling us, okay, we're going to do display grid. And for something like this, we'd have grid template columns, 150 pixels, 1 FR, and then grid template rows, 100 auto and auto. And let me see if I can get this any larger. It's a little hard to zoom in this application with it being an ebook. But so you would say, I want grid template columns. You would put that for the container. So the container is probably a div wrapper, or you could, if you didn't have it in a wrapper, you could apply it to the body. So So let's say that it's a wrapper. You would have your wrapper, and then you would say, I want the display to be grid. And then you would say, okay, well, I want to have 2 columns. And what's going to happen, this is where you have to look at these lines. We've got line 1 is this outside. Line 2 is separating the nav from the main. The header takes up 2 of these. If you think of it like a table, it's taking up 2 cells. And the footer is also taking up 2 cells. And then we have the last line. And this is where I really recommend, if you are working with grids in the future, just draw it out. It'll make so much more sense if you draw it. And so what we would say is we want first our sizes. So we've got 150 pixels is our first size. It doesn't really matter for the header and the footer, but for the nav, where it's only going to take up one of those columns, that needs to have 150 pixels. And then it's telling us here that for the width, it's going to be 1 FR. It's basically just going to take up the rest of that space. So it's that fractional unit. So you would write 150 pixels space and then 1 FR. And then grid template rows, we've got 100 pixels for the height. So that has to be 100 pixels. And then we don't have any specifications for any of this. We just got auto. And then this is a little deceiving because this is saying this is 50 pixels. So I would think that this should say 100 pixels, auto, 50 pixels. And what they might be doing is they might be, instead of controlling it here, they might have a style that is in the footer that is instead saying this is going to be 50 pixels. So just be careful of that. I don't know why they chose to do it that way, because I do think it doesn't really match the drawing. But hopefully you at least get the idea of how you could take something like this where everything's not matching up, and you could kind of see how someone could draw it. So you have to kind of look for these individual columns, and then we've got these 3 rows going across. And then because you have things where they are kind of going further beyond, then now for each individual item, you have to say, where does it span on those lines? So you can see here we've got header, nav, main, and footer, and it uses these properties, grid row, grid column. So this grid template columns, grid template rows, let me just put a note here. Applied to container. And then this also would be applied to container. And then for your grid row and grid column properties, these would be applied to the individual items inside of the grid. And so you're going to have grid, oh, there we go, grid row, and then you're going to have grid column. And for both of these, you will list the lines that the item sits, I'll say between. And you write this, it ends up looking like a fraction. You basically say the first value, and then you put / and then you put the second, or I'll say last value. So it takes a little bit of looking at, but let me go back previous page. So looking at this for the header, and this is where people get kind of confused, and that's why I wanted to remind you, rows are horizontal, columns are vertical. So if you were first defining all of the columns, you would say, okay, the header starts at the first line. So it's going to be 1, and then people get confused because they'll think it's 2 spaces, but we're not looking at the spaces, we're looking at the lines. So you would say it starts at 1 and it ends at 3. So it's 1/3. And that would be for the columns. And then for the rows, it's starting at the first line and it's ending at the second line. So you would say grid row 1/2. And then the nav is for the column is starting at 1 and it's ending at line 2. And that's why I like drawing it, because you can kind of see more easily like where 2 and 3 are. So nav grid column 1/2, and then nav grid row 2, because it's starting at the second line, 2/3. And then once you have those, everything else starts to get a little easier because you can kind of line it up based off the last one. So main grid column 2/3, grid row 2/3. And then footer is going to be grid column 1/3, because it's going all the way to the third one. And then it's going to be grid row 3/4. And then that allows you to make them any size you want. Like you could just say that you don't want to have any fixed dimensions. You could remove all of that, and depending on whatever size the content was within it, it would know to sort of stretch those in whatever way you would need to fit to have that. So that's how you can have it be responsive instead of having to be a little bit more fixed like that bird example. But it's also what makes it a little more confusing. I almost think of it like, let's say you were trying to draw this out with a bunch of rubber bands, and you could stretch the rubber bands. The rubber bands would still kind of split all the spaces, but you could flex them and they could resize to fit the content. It's really hard to sort of imagine it. And that's, again, why I think it's helpful to kind of draw it out and kind of plan things out if you are planning on working with a grid. So you have the line numbers as a way for you to designate the items inside of it. They're basically taking this example and they're turning it into a practice. So this would be really good to go and do as well. Now there's this other property which some people might find a little bit easier, and that's working with grid areas instead. And for anyone who might have like the 5th edition of the book, I think this is one of the areas where it's different. The 6th edition talks about this grid area property versus, if I'm remembering right, the 5th edition doesn't talk about this, but it's basically defining these areas instead of having to use the lines to divide it. And what you do is you still need to say your header, your nav, your main and footer. But what you're doing is, and try to think of these like IDs, where you're saying you're creating this thing that's being called a header, and you're creating this area that's called a nav, and you're going to refer to it later. So each of your different items would still need to have something defined about them. And then you would need to use this grid template area property. So here's a good example where it's taking the columns, it's still writing out what the spacing would be. In this one, it looks like they actually did the footer right, where they put the 50 pixels. So they put the grid template rows, and then they're saying, okay, in the container, we're going to do grid template areas, and then you defined it for each individual item. So now in quotes, you say, this is where you can kind of picture it a little bit more like a table, where you're blocking out your cells and you're saying the first 2 cells are going to contain header and header. And then in the next row, you've got your cells nav and main. And then in your next cells, in your next row, you have footer and footer. So this visually, I think, is a little easier to kind of look at. It still requires you to have those 2 parts, but instead you use the grid template areas property. So let me just put that in there. Grid template areas. So this is applied to the container. And I'm just gonna write out the example where you basically map out where things are based off the rows. I'll just put a note. Need to define what the area items are by applying them to the items. Trying to think if there's a better way of saying that. I'm basically trying to say, like, this idea of header, that's basically the equivalent of an ID. Like, we could call that unicorn if we wanted. So we could say unicorn, football, whatever we want to have. We're using names that make sense, but you have to define what header is in the header. Whoops. Like that example had where you have grid area header. So you have to use grid area. I'm going to bold that so it stands out, to define these terms on the individual pieces. And then here you're using grid template areas. So let me write that. So you have grid template for that template, and then grid areas defining what the area is. So you're creating the areas, and then you are creating a template of your areas. Hopefully that makes sense. And then this is kind of nice. This is showing, like, it is possible to have empty areas within a grid layout. So they're saying, like, here's how you could go ahead and do that. And what they're doing with the areas is they're putting in a period as sort of a placeholder. So that way, if you didn't want the footer to actually span the whole space, you could have it kind of block in this cell. So that way it's not doing anything. And that could be something where when you are creating a grid for your form, you might find that helpful if you wanted to kind of fill up the space that way. So you'll notice that the book ends up having quite a bit of practice working with the grid, and both working with the lines and then also working with the areas. Again, that's something that is really elaborated on a lot in the 6th edition to try to make it so students get a lot more practice with it. Earlier editions of the book didn't have that, and so I think people struggled a lot more with the grid and trying to figure out how to get it to work. And you're not going to need to have the grid for your assignment. I just want you to have a good understanding of it for the future. And then this is back to where we were at when looking at that supports. And so it's going to tell you about how you could set that up in an example where you could say, I want to, like, if a browser supports display grid, then I want to, and then basically do all of this. And it looks like they're using an example that uses the grid area for practice. All right, so the next information that I want to go over, I'm going to do in another video where I'm going to talk about things that are kind of more specific to how you might want to set things up to make it responsive for mobile, but then also looking at media queries and how you can create your sets of styles. And then I'm going to try to fit in that same video a basic template that could help you when you're working with your final project. If I feel like that's getting too long, I might turn that into its own video. I'll just have to kind of see once I start actually recording that. So again, if you've got any questions, you can leave a comment in the discussion or you can send me an email.